The last paved road crumbled into a track of cracked shale and ancient, sea-worn gravel, a fitting prelude to the desolation Dean had sought. For hours, the world had thinned, each mile shedding another layer of the life he was determined to leave behind. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white against the faded plastic, the rhythmic rumble of the tires over the stones a dull counterpoint to the relentless churn of his own thoughts. The promise of the open sea, the sheer, crushing isolation of it all, was the only balm he could imagine. He needed the vast, indifferent emptiness to swallow him whole, to erase the sharp edges of a past that clawed at his sleep, a past he refused to name even to himself. Then, through a sudden break in the mist that had clung to the coastline like a shroud, it appeared. The lighthouse. Not the pristine, postcard image, but a gaunt, weathered sentinel, its whitewash flaking like old skin, the ironwork rusted to the color of dried blood. It stood on a jagged promontory, a defiant finger against the bruised gray sky, the furious Atlantic battering its base with ceaseless, frothing assaults. He parked the rented vehicle a respectful distance away, the engine's dying cough swallowed by the roaring wind and the mournful cry of gulls. The air was a brutal assault of salt and damp, carrying the metallic tang of decay that seemed to cling to the very stone of the lighthouse. Dean stepped out, the wind immediately snatching at his jacket, pulling at him as if to drag his back, or perhaps, out into the churning expanse of water. He paused, letting the raw force of the elements scour him, a perverse baptism. This was it. The furthest edge. The silence here, even amidst the ocean's clamor, felt profound, a hollow ache that echoed the one inside him. The estate lawyer, a man whose tailored suit seemed impossibly out of place against the backdrop of a storm-lashed window, had spoken of Dean's distant relative with a carefully neutral tone. A solitary man, he'd offered, preferred his own company. And then, with a slight, almost imperceptible shift in his gaze, he simply ceased to be here. No note. No trace. The sea, you understand, it takes what it wants. Dean had understood perfectly. He wanted the sea to take him too, if only metaphorically. The pathway to the lighthouse door was overgrown with hardy, salt-blasted weeds, their stems rattling like dry bones in the wind. The heavy oak door, studded with black iron, groaned open on reluctant hinges, exhaling a breath of stale, cold air. It smelled of dust, old wood, and something else, a faint, earthy musk, like damp soil or something long buried. The interior was a cavernous cylinder, the spiral staircase winding upwards into gloom, the only light filtering through narrow, grime-streaked windows. Every creak of the ancient timbers, every sigh of the wind through ill-fitting frames, felt amplified, a whisper in the vast emptiness. He began his survey, his footsteps echoing hollowly on the stone floor. The ground level held little more than storage, rusted tools hanging on pegs, coils of stiff rope, and empty oil drums. On the second floor, a small living area, sparse and Spartan, revealed the relative Spartan existence, a narrow cot, a single wooden chair, a table holding a tarnished kettle and a chipped mug. No personal effects, no photographs, nothing to betray a life lived. It was as if the man had evaporated, taking his essence with him. Further up, a narrow passage led away from the main tower, a low-ceilinged annex that seemed an afterthought. It was here, tucked away, that he found it, the weather station. A small, almost claustrophobic room, its single grimy window facing the furious expanse of the ocean. Old charts, yellowed and brittle, were pinned to the walls. An array of antique instruments, a barometer with a trembling needle, an anemometer whose cups were caked with salt, a hygrometer, stood sentinel. A heavy, leather-bound logbook lay open on a sturdy desk, its pages stiff with age. He sat on the stool, the wood groaning under his weight, and leaned closer. The handwriting was precise, almost calligraphic, charting wind speeds, temperatures, cloud formations. Days blurred into weeks, then months. Until he reached the final entries. He scanned a page, his eyes catching on an anomaly. The handwriting, once so neat, began to falter, growing more erratic. And then, not weather data, but scrawled, almost frantic notes. "The hum is louder tonight." From below. His gaze dropped to the next entry. "It has a rhythm. A pulse. Not wind. Not waves. Something else." The ink was smudged, as if the writer's hand had trembled. "Waiting. The light. It calls them. My beacon. It is theirs now. It calls him. Below it, not text, but a crude, hastily drawn symbol. It looked like a series of concentric circles, but warped, misshapen, with jagged lines radiating outwards like distorted tendrils. Dean's breath hitched. This wasn't the logbook of a solitary man charting atmospheric pressure. This was a desperate testament, a descent into something terrifying. He was not alone in this remote place, not truly. Someone had been here before him, someone who had seen something, heard something, and then vanished. The lighthouse, Dean realized with a jolt, was not just a remote outpost. It was a witness. And now, he was its only occupant. The raw wind outside seemed to howl not with indifference, but with a nascent hunger. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as the old pickup finally crested a low rise. Below, stark against the bruised twilight sky, stood the lighthouse. It was a skeletal finger of stone and iron, reaching into a churning expanse of gray-green ocean, its beacon dark, its flanks streaked with decades of salt and neglect. Dean killed the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the shriek of gulls and the relentless, hungry growl of the waves against the cliff face. This was it. The end of the road, the end of the world he knew. He stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots like brittle bones. The wind, a constant, unseen force, tugged at his coat, whispering secrets it had gathered from across the vast, empty water. He surveyed the structure, a mix of grim satisfaction and a prickle of unease stirring within him. It was more imposing, more isolated than the photographs had suggested. A truly desolate place, perfect for disappearing. The heavy oak door, warped by countless storms, groaned open under his push, revealing a cavernous interior. His footsteps echoed on the stone floor as he navigated the gloom, flicking on the few working light switches. He spent the first few hours simply moving boxes, his back aching, the rhythmic thud of his belongings against the floorboards the only sound. As dusk deepened into true night, the first anomaly arrived. He was in the small living area, attempting to coax a reluctant fire in the hearth, when the single overhead bulb flickered. Dean paused, poker in hand. Old wiring, he thought, pushing down a sudden, illogical tremor. Just old wiring in an old building. He resumed his task, but the incident had left a faint, unpleasant taste in his mouth. Later, as he tried to sleep on a makeshift bed in what he assumed was the keeper's quarters, the sounds began. The lighthouse groaned inside, a symphony of wind and ancient wood, but there were other noises. A distinct scraping, like heavy stone against stone, seemed to emanate from the spiral staircase leading up to the lantern room. Then, a low, resonant thrum, a vibration that seemed to travel through the very foundations of the structure, rising and falling like a slow, deep breath. He lay rigid, listening, his breath held. It was probably just the wind, he told himself, playing tricks on the old mechanisms, or the shifting of the building in the relentless coastal gusts. But the thrum felt too deliberate, too rhythmic to be merely a natural phenomenon. The feeling of being watched intensified with each passing hour. He found himself constantly glancing over his shoulder, his senses hyper-alert, straining to catch a movement, a sound that wasn't there. He was here to escape, to find peace, not to descend into paranoia. On the third day, driven by a restless urge to understand the building's history, Dean began exploring the small, dusty office adjacent to the living quarters. These weren't official records, but personal journals kept by previous lighthouse keepers. He settled into a creaking chair, the pages rustling like dry leaves as he turned them. The earliest entries were mundane, detailing weather patterns and ship sightings. But as he progressed through the years, the tone shifted. One entry, dated nearly a century ago, spoke of the strange light playing tricks in the tower, not from the lamp. From within the glass itself. Another, from a keeper named Thomas, chronicled weeks of unnatural calm on the water. The compass spun wildly. Thomas's hand grew shakier with each entry, describing the scratching from below, constant now, even when the tide is out, and a deep, resonant hum that shakes the very bones of this place. He wrote of the men from the supply boat refusing to stay overnight, claiming the air was too heavy, too watchful. Dean's fingers traced the brittle paper. He found a particularly disturbing passage, dated just a few decades prior. Calling dot. Dean closed the journal, the leather cool beneath his trembling fingers. The sea did strange things to people. Yet, the echoes of their experiences resonated with his own growing unease. The flickering lights, the deep thrum, the pervasive sense of being observed, they were not just in his head. Other men had felt them too. The solitude he had so desperately sought now felt less like a refuge and more like a trap. The lighthouse, he realized, was not just a building, it was a sentinel, and whatever it guarded, whatever it called, was very close indeed. Dean closed the journal, the leather cool beneath his trembling fingers. The lamp above him hummed, casting its rhythmic beam across the cluttered room, a steady, reassuring pulse against the encroaching silence. Sleep offered no respite. His nights became a churning maelstrom of distorted images and suffocating sensations. He dreamed of being submerged in icy water, the pressure immense, crushing. Faces, indistinct and featureless, swirled in the gloom, their mouths opening in silent screams. He'd wake with a gasp, his chest tight, the taste of salt on his tongue, his blankets tangled around him like seaweed. During the day, the unease solidified into something more tangible. A flicker of movement behind the kitchen window, a brief, elongated shape crossing the hallway when he turned his head too fast. He'd spin around, his heart thudding against his ribs, only to find nothing but the empty space, the dust motes dancing in the weak sunlight. He began to question his own perception, attributing it to fatigue, to the strain of isolation, to the journal's unsettling narratives playing on his mind. At first, he dismissed them as the wind howling through the lighthouse's stone walls, or the waves crashing against the rocky base. He couldn't quite make out words, not clearly, but there was a distinct rhythm to them, a cadence that felt almost like a hushed conversation. Sometimes, he felt certain he heard his own name, drawn out and distorted, carried on the spray that coated the lantern room glass. The growing isolation, a solitude he had initially craved, began to feel like a cage. He needed to hear a human voice, to connect with the outside world, if only to confirm its continued existence. He tried the lighthouse's antiquated radio, a chunky piece of equipment nestled in a corner of the main living area. He knew the basics from his predecessor's notes: frequency, tuning, squelch. He powered it on, the tubes glowing with a familiar warmth. But all he got was static, a relentless hiss that drowned out any potential signal. He fiddled with the dials, adjusted the antenna, tapped the casing. Nothing. Just the white noise, a barrier between him and any hope of contact. He thought of the backup, the emergency satellite phone he'd packed away. He retrieved it, a sleek, modern device contrasting sharply with the lighthouse's aged technology. He powered it on, the screen flickering to life. The call wouldn't connect. Network unavailable, the display read, stark white against the gray screen. He tried again, and again. The same message. He climbed to the lantern room, hoping for better reception, holding the phone aloft, but the outcome was identical. He was cut off. Completely. A desperate thought clawed at him: the old weather station. It was a smaller, squat building, a few hundred yards inland from the lighthouse, nestled in a dip of the rocky terrain. It had been abandoned for years, but perhaps some of its equipment, or at least a working landline, might still be operational. He grabbed his heavy coat, the wind already whipping around the lighthouse, and began the trek across the desolate ground. The air was thick with mist, obscuring the horizon, making the landscape feel even more alien and unwelcoming. The weather station's door groaned open on rusted hinges, revealing a single, cramped room filled with obsolete instruments. Barometers with tarnished brass, anemometers with broken blades, and a long-dead console covered in dust. He ran his hand over the cold metal, a shiver tracing his spine. He searched for anything, a power source, a functional communication device. There was nothing. Just relics of a forgotten purpose. He kicked at a loose floorboard in frustration, a cloud of dust puffing up. He bent down, his fingers brushing against something soft and damp. He pulled it out. It was his own woolen scarf, the one he had worn on the boat journey to the island, the one he had left draped over the back of a chair in the lighthouse kitchen yesterday morning. His mind reeled, grasping for a rational explanation, but there was none. He had locked the lighthouse door when he left. No one else was on the island. How could it be here? How could it be damp, as if recently submerged? He clutched the scarf, its familiar texture now alien and terrifying, a perverse violation. He was no longer merely isolated, he was being toyed with. He was being watched. And whatever watched him, whatever had moved his scarf, was not content with just observing. It was making its presence known, twisting his reality, reminding him that the desolate outpost was no longer his sanctuary, but its domain. He felt a tremor deep within him, a vibration that had nothing to do with the lighthouse's machinery or the ceaseless churn of the ocean. It was an internal tremor, a premonition of something vast and terrible. The lamp on the small table cast an anemic circle of light, barely pushing back the encroaching shadows that clung to the corners of the keeper's room. He stood, a restless energy buzzing beneath his skin, demanding action, demanding an answer that the old logs couldn't provide. He needed facts, something concrete to anchor himself against the swirling tide of dread. He remembered a fleeting mention in one of the earlier, less frantic logs, a note about a specialized wind gauge, an older, more robust model housed in the small, squat building known as the weather station near the base of the lighthouse. The keeper had written of its superior accuracy during severe gales, a detail Dean had dismissed as technical minutiae at the time. Now, it felt like a lifeline. The wind, a physical force, slammed into him, tearing at his clothes, whipping his hair across his face. The weather station stood a short distance away, a low, windowless structure of rough-hewn stone, hunkering against the elements like a stubborn, ancient crab. The door, heavy with rust, groaned in protest as he forced it open. The beam from his flashlight cut through the absolute blackness, revealing a cluttered space. Dust motes danced in the light, suspended in the still air. Old barometers, their brass cases tarnished, hung crookedly on the walls. Anemometers lay scattered on a workbench, their delicate cups bent and broken. The smell of mildew and forgotten things was potent. He moved slowly, his boots crunching on grit and dried leaves that had somehow found their way inside. He ran his hand over a heavy wooden table, the surface rough and splintered. This was where the old keeper had sat, painstakingly recording data, perhaps listening to the same relentless howl of the wind. He found the robust wind gauge, a heavy, iron-cased instrument, exactly as described, but its needle was frozen, rusted solid. Disappointment pricked him. Another dead end. But as he turned to leave, his flashlight beam caught something unusual. Not on the table, or the walls, but on the floor. He knelt, scraping away layers of grime and dust with his gloved hand. The stone wasn't just higher, it was loose. He wedged his fingers into the narrow gap and heaved. The stone, surprisingly heavy, came up with a grinding scrape, revealing a shallow cavity beneath. It wasn't a practical storage space, too small for tools, too exposed for anything valuable. Inside, nestled on a bed of what felt like dried, brittle seaweed, lay a single object. It was not a logbook, nor a forgotten tool. It was a carving, roughly the size of his palm, made of a material he couldn't identify. It felt like polished stone, yet it was impossibly light, almost buoyant. The shape was abstract, yet disturbingly organic, a twisted, flowing form that hinted at a coiling tentacle, or a grasping limb, or perhaps a stylized wave cresting into a predatory claw. He picked it up. As his fingers closed around it, a faint, almost imperceptible pulse seemed to throb from within the strange material. His flashlight beam traced the details of the carving. Etched into its surface, so fine they were almost invisible, were symbols. They weren't letters, nor any hieroglyphs he'd ever seen. They were lines, arcs, and sharp angles that coalesced into patterns. One pattern, repeated several times, seemed to depict the lighthouse itself, but not as a beacon of safety. In these etchings, the lighthouse was a funnel, its light not a guide, but a lure. And at its base, where the structure met the turbulent sea, a gaping maw, a swirling vortex of lines that suggested immense, hungry depths. His breath hitched. He wasn't looking at the work of a lonely, superstitious man. This was something else. The symbols spoke of power, of drawing, of consumption. The entity wasn't a ghost, a lingering spirit of the drowned. It was older, far older, a primal force tied to the very essence of the ocean, using the lighthouse not as a home, but as an instrument. Then, his gaze fell upon another set of symbols, etched with a slightly different hand, almost as an addendum to the main design. These were more linear, more recent. And among them, a familiar pattern, a stylized representation of his family crest, a small, intricate design he had seen on an old signet ring his distant relative had worn. It was unmistakable. And next to it, a subtle, almost hidden motif that resembled the intricate scar tissue on his own left forearm, the lasting mark of the trauma he had sought to escape. The inheritance. The isolated location. The trauma that had driven him here, seeking solace. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a random haunting. The lighthouse wasn't just a place where something terrible resided, it was a trap. A meticulously laid snare, designed not for just anyone, but for him. The entity had chosen him, drawn him in with the promise of escape, of solitude, knowing his specific vulnerabilities, his specific needs. He was not merely an occupant, but the next intended sacrifice, lured to this desolate outpost by a malevolence as ancient and patient as the sea itself. Dean tried to force the journal's cryptic entries from his mind, but the words had sunk their hooks deep. The pull. The whispers. Men broke in such places, their minds conjuring phantoms from the sea mist. Yet, a chill, colder than any draft, had settled in his bones. He knew the difference between a building settling and something else shifting. The air in the living quarters grew heavy, thick with a scent he couldn't quite place, not salt, not decay, but something ancient and wet, like the inside of a forgotten shell. It clung to the fabric of the old sofa, permeated the pages of his book, and seemed to seep from the very stone walls. He stood, pacing the small space, his boots thudding softly on the worn floorboards. A low thrum vibrated beneath his feet, a resonance that felt less like machinery and more like a vast, unseen heartbeat. It pulsed, slow and deep, then faded, only to return with a subtle shift in rhythm. He found himself constantly scanning the periphery of his vision. But the impression lingered, a residual flicker of something that had been there a moment before. He was tired, he reasoned, his nerves frayed. The lighthouse was playing tricks on him. Then came the sounds. Not the usual groan of the structure, nor the shriek of the gulls. These were softer, more insidious. A dragging sound, like heavy cloth across stone, from the winding stairwell above. A faint,
wet slurp that seemed to emanate from the floorboards directly beneath his feet. He froze, straining to hear over the incessant wind. The sound ceased the moment he focused, leaving only the dull roar of the ocean against the rocks. He clenched his jaw, his knuckles white. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the kitchen. Dean spun, his heart hammering against his ribs. A ceramic mug, one he'd left on the counter, lay in shattered pieces on the floor, its handle severed cleanly. It hadn't fallen, it had been thrown. There was no earthquake, no tremor. The floor had been steady. He was alone. He backed away slowly, his gaze sweeping the empty room. He felt an intense pressure, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on him, trying to squeeze the air from his lungs. He needed to get out, to find a signal, to call for help. He grabbed his satellite phone, its reassuring weight a small comfort. No signal. He tried again, moving closer to a window, then to the door. Nothing. The screen remained blank, a dead gray expanse reflecting his own panicked face. The battery was full, he charged it just that morning. He cursed under his breath, his determination hardening. He would go to the weather station. It was old, but it had a radio, an emergency beacon. It was his best chance. He flung open the heavy oak door to the outside. The wind immediately tore at his clothes, a furious, biting gale. He squinted into the gloom. The path to the weather station, a winding track carved into the cliff face, looked treacherous. He started down it, leaning into the wind, his boots slipping on the damp stones. The spray from the crashing waves lashed his face, stinging his eyes. Halfway there, a low, guttural roar ripped through the storm, not the sea, but something impossibly deep, impossibly close. It resonated in his chest, vibrating through his bones. The very ground seemed to shudder. He stumbled, catching himself on a jagged outcrop of rock. He looked back towards the lighthouse, its beam cutting a frantic arc through the tempest. For a split second, in the swirling mist, he thought he saw a shape, vast and indistinct, rising from the churning waters near the base of the tower. It was gone before he could truly register it, subsumed by the frothing chaos of the sea. He pushed onward, his breath ragged, the image burned into his mind. He reached the small, squat building of the weather station, its metal siding rattling violently in the wind. He fumbled with the rusted lock, his fingers numb, finally forcing it open with a grunt of effort. Inside, the air was still, thick with the smell of ozone and damp electronics. He flicked on the emergency lantern he kept there. The radio console was ripped apart, wires dangling like severed nerves. The emergency beacon, its red casing cracked, lay smashed on the floor. The anemometer, meant to measure wind speed, was twisted into an impossible knot, its delicate cups flattened and mangled. But it was the barometer that truly unnerved him. Its glass face was shattered, and etched onto the metal plate beneath, as if scored by a claw, were symbols he recognized from the journal. Crude, swirling lines. An eye. A gaping maw. His breath hitched. This wasn't weather damage. This was deliberate. And it wasn't old. The metal beneath the scratches gleamed faintly, freshly exposed. Whatever had done this had been here recently. He backed away, tripping over a fallen chair. This wasn't a warning. This was a statement. He was trapped. The entity wasn't just lurking in the periphery, it was here, inside the lighthouse, inside the very fabric of his world. It had cut him off, methodically, completely. It sounded like something immense was dragging itself against the outside, testing the door's strength. Dean stumbled back, his eyes darting frantically around the small, vandalized room. He was not alone. He had never been alone. He was merely the latest offering. The journal's words had become a relentless hum behind Dean's eyes,
a buzzing swarm of gnats in his skull. The pull. The whispers. The hunger. He tried to rationalize it, to blame the isolation, the ceaseless wind, the creak of old timbers groaning under the lighthouse's weight. Men broke in such places, their minds conjuring phantoms from the salt spray and the endless gray. But Dean knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his marrow, that this was no mere unraveling. This was an invasion. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing in on him. The scent of brine, once a nostalgic comfort, now carried an acrid, metallic tang, like old blood mixed with rust. He'd whirl around, heart hammering against his ribs, only to find the room empty, save for the dust motes dancing in the meager light. Yet, the sensation of being watched, of being stalked, never receded. Sleep offered no respite. The lighthouse, once his sanctuary, had become a cage, its very structure groaning with malevolent intent. Every floorboard creaked with an unnatural rhythm, every gust of wind through the broken panes sounded like a sigh of anticipation. He started talking to himself, his voice a ragged whisper in the echoing silence, trying to anchor himself to something real. He saw faces in the peeling wallpaper, heard his name called by voices that weren't there, felt the distinct vibration of something vast and heavy moving beneath the very foundations of the structure. One particularly harrowing night, as the storm raged outside, rattling the lantern room and sending sheets of rain lashing against the glass, Dean found himself hunched in the kitchen, a rusty utility knife clutched in his trembling hand. He'd heard it then, distinct and undeniable, a rhythmic thump-thump-thump from the floor above, slow and deliberate, like something immense dragging itself across the attic floor. He knew there was nothing up there but old crates and forgotten junk. Yet the sound continued, growing louder, closer, accompanied by a low, guttural moan that seemed to resonate in his bones. His mind, frayed and desperate, latched onto a fleeting memory from the old journal, a cryptic notation scrawled in the margins of a page detailing the lighthouse's construction, the hum of the deep. A frequency only the lost can hear. An anchor point. And then, an even older memory, from a conversation with a local fisherman about the area's history, about the weather station further down the coast. Abandoned for decades. They used to monitor everything there, the fisherman had said, the currents, the winds, even the strange sounds from the deep. A desperate, terrifying idea began to form. What if the entity wasn't just attracted to the light, but to a specific frequency that the light somehow amplified? And what if the old weather station, with its forgotten instruments and its history of monitoring the sea's subtle shifts, held a clue to disrupting that frequency? The journey to the weather station was a blur of wind-whipped rain and treacherous, uneven terrain. He felt the pull, stronger now, urging his back to the lighthouse, to his designated fate. But a sliver of defiance, a desperate, animalistic will to survive, propelled him forward. He found the weather station an hour later, a skeletal structure of rusted metal and crumbling concrete, barely visible through the driving rain. The door, long rotted, hung askew on a single hinge, groaning in the wind. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Old charts lay scattered across the floor, brittle and yellowed. A rusted anemometer lay on its side, its cups long since corroded away. He moved through the debris, his breath catching in his throat, a primal fear coiling in his gut. He scanned the room, his eyes darting over defunct gauges and broken dials, until his gaze snagged on a heavy, wooden chest tucked beneath a collapsed workbench. It was surprisingly intact, secured with a corroded iron latch. With a grunt, Dean forced the latch open. Inside, nestled among moth-eaten canvas and what looked like old logbooks, was a strange, intricate device. It was a brass cylinder, about the size of his forearm, covered in tiny, etched symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the gloom. Beside it lay a leather-bound journal, much older than the one he'd found in the lighthouse, its pages brittle with age. He opened it, his fingers trembling. The script was faded, but legible. It was the log of a former station chief, detailing their observations of strange sonic phenomena emanating from the deep, particularly when the lighthouse beam was active. Then, buried deep within, a series of diagrams and calculations. They weren't mathematical formulas in the conventional sense, but rather precise notations of harmonic frequencies, accompanied by illustrations of the brass device. One entry, scrawled in a frantic hand, stood out: the siren's true song. A frequency of hunger. The light amplifies it. But a countersong, a dissonant chord, struck at the nexus of the beam. It can sever the pull. It can blind the eye. The device, then. This was it. A counter-frequency. A way to fight back. But the instructions were complex, the warnings dire. The power required. Immense. The risk. Madness or worse. It must be aimed true, at the heart of the beacon, at the moment of its greatest hunger. He looked from the journal to the strange brass cylinder, then back towards the distant, unwavering beam of the lighthouse. A plan, terrifying in its audacity, began to solidify in his mind. He wasn't just a sacrifice. He could be the one to sever the pull. The wind shrieked a mournful lament around the lantern room, a sound that burrowed into Dean's bones. He clutched the heavy brass cylinder, its cold surface a small anchor in the rising tide of his terror. The final entry, scrawled in a frantic hand, spoke of a resonance, a frequency that could disrupt the ancient pull. It was a desperate theory, a gamble with his sanity and his life. He looked out at the churning blackness of the sea, illuminated in brief, violent flashes by the lighthouse beam. The entity was not just out there, it was here, a suffocating presence that had seeped into the very stone and iron of the structure. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and something else, a deep, metallic tang like old blood mixed with brine, a scent that prickled the back of his throat. He could feel it, a crushing weight in his chest, a whisper at the edges of his hearing that threatened to unravel his mind. The glass panes of the lantern room rattled violently, and for a horrifying moment, Dean thought they would shatter. He braced himself against the central pedestal of the lamp, his knuckles white. This wasn't just the storm, this was it. It was responding to his intent, a predator sensing its prey's futile defiance. He had to get to the weather station. The journal indicated that the old atmospheric instruments, despite their age, somehow amplified the resonant frequency of the tower itself. It was the only place, the scribbled notes implied, where the lighthouse's own inherent properties could be turned against the thing that had claimed it. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Dean descended the spiral staircase. Each step echoed unnaturally in the confined space, swallowed by the rising cacophony of the storm and something else, a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The iron steps felt slick beneath his grip, not with water, but with a cold, viscous film that left his fingers tingling with an unpleasant numbness. He tried not to think about what it might be. The light grew dimmer as he descended, the powerful beam above him receding into a blinding halo. He pushed open the heavy, rusted door to the weather station. The room was small, circular, filled with the ghostly silhouettes of antiquated barometers, anemometers, and thermographs. A wave of crushing pressure hit him, pushing the air from his lungs. He stumbled, his back hitting the wall, the brass cylinder slipping slightly in his grasp. Then he saw it. Or rather, he felt it. It wasn't a distinct shape, not a creature of flesh and bone. It pulsed, a silent, rhythmic beat that resonated directly inside his skull, a soundless scream that threatened to shatter his eardrums. The air grew impossibly heavy, crushing, like being dragged to the bottom of the deepest trench. His mind reeled. Images flashed before his eyes, the trawler, the churning waves, the faces of the lost. The entity was probing, twisting his past trauma into fresh agony, trying to break his will, to make him surrender. You are nothing. You are broken. He remembered the journal's instructions. He staggered towards an old, freestanding barometer, its glass dome cloudy with age. With trembling hands, he placed the brass cylinder onto its flat, wooden base. As the metal touched the wood, a low hum began to emanate from the cylinder, a sound barely audible at first, then slowly, steadily, growing in intensity. The entity reacted. The crushing pressure intensified, flattening him against the barometer. Dean forced his gaze onto the brass cylinder. He focused on the hum, trying to match it with his own breath, his own desperate heartbeat. The hum grew into a vibrating thrum, a deep, resonant chord that filled the weather station. The old barometer began to shake violently, its needle quivering. The other instruments rattled, their glass faces vibrating. The entity shrieked, a soundless howl that tore at the fabric of Dean's mind, but it was receding, its formless presence flickering at the edges of the room. He felt a searing pain in his temples, as if his brain was being stretched to its breaking point. Blood trickled from his nose, warm and coppery on his lip. The lighthouse itself groaned, a metallic shriek of protest as if it were being torn apart. The beam from the lantern room above flickered, stuttered, then stabilized, but now it seemed to pulse with a strange, dissonant rhythm, out of sync with its usual, steady sweep. The entity was weakening, its hold on the lighthouse, on Dean, tenuous. But it wasn't gone. Not yet. Dean pushed harder, pouring every ounce of his fear, his defiance, his desperate hope into the humming brass cylinder. This wasn't just about survival, it was about severing the pull, cutting the ancient connection, and perhaps, just perhaps, setting the lighthouse free. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since he had arrived, Dean felt a sliver of something akin to control. The wind's shriek tore through Dean, a sound that burrowed into his bones and rattled his teeth. He clutched the heavy brass cylinder, its cold, ridged surface a small anchor in the rising tide of his terror. The journal lay open on the narrow metal shelf beside him, its pages rustling with unseen currents, whispering secrets he now understood with a horrifying clarity. He remembered the instructions, scrawled in faded ink, not a spell, but a sequence. A precise alignment of the cylinder within the lantern's mechanism, a turning, a click, then the desperate, agonizing wait. He had pushed the cylinder into the central shaft of the light, feeling the ancient metal grate against the newer components. Then twisted it with all his might. A metallic clack echoed, unnervingly loud above the gale. For a moment, nothing happened. The entity's presence, an icy claw in his mind, tightened. Then, a shudder ran through the entire tower, a deep, guttural groan that vibrated up from the foundations. The light itself flickered, not like a dying flame, but like a vast, invisible hand had reached in and squeezed it. The pressure in his head lessened, then abruptly vanished. The shriek of the wind outside muted, transforming into a dull roar. The shimmering distortion dissipated, leaving only the endless, churning gray of the storm. Dean stumbled back, his legs weak, gasping for air he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His hands trembled so violently he had to brace them against the cold metal railing. He was alive. He had done it. The wind still howled, but it felt distant now, as if a thick, sound-absorbing wall had materialized between him and the tempest. He could smell ozone and salt, but the cloying scent of ancient, stagnant decay had vanished. He looked at the light. It pulsed steadily now, a powerful, unwavering beam cutting through the gloom. The brass cylinder was still embedded, its surface now warm to the touch, almost humming with a low, imperceptible vibration. Not a weapon to destroy, but a seal to contain. He hadn't banished the entity, he had merely locked it back inside its prison, and in doing so, had become its new, unwitting jailer. His descent from the lantern room was a blur of aching muscles and a mind teetering on the edge of collapse. Each step down the spiral staircase was a monumental effort. The lighthouse itself seemed to sag around him, the metal groaning softly, the stone walls weeping moisture. On the lower levels, he saw the storm's damage, water had seeped in through cracks, pooling on the floorboards, and a section of the outer railing had been twisted into grotesque shapes. Yet, the overwhelming sense of malevolence was gone, replaced by a suffocating emptiness. He staggered out of the lighthouse, collapsing onto the rain-slicked rock. The storm was dying, the sky a bruised purple at the horizon. The waves still crashed against the cliffs with furious abandon, but the wind had dropped to a mere bluster. He pushed himself to his feet, a dull ache throbbing behind his eyes. He couldn't stay here, not now, not ever again. His gaze fell upon a squat, concrete structure perhaps a quarter-mile down the coast, perched precariously on a rocky outcrop. The weather station. He remembered seeing it on his initial survey of the island, a forgotten outpost of human endeavor. He needed answers, or at least, a place to process the horrifying truth. The walk was grueling, his legs heavy, his mind numb. The wind picked up again as he neared the weather station, whistling through its broken windows like a mournful dirge. The door, rusted on its hinges, gave way with a screech that made him flinch. Inside, the air was stale and thick with the smell of damp concrete and decay. He moved through the derelict rooms, past rusted instruments and overturned chairs, until he found a small office. A desk, half collapsed, held a stack of water-damaged logbooks. He carefully pulled one free, its cover flaking, its pages brittle. The entries were dated, meticulously recorded observations of wind speed, barometric pressure, sea conditions. And then, he found it. Correlates with ship disappearances. Magnetic fluctuations off the charts. He flipped to the last few pages, dated decades ago. It feeds. Not just on souls, but on the attention star. The fear. The brass cylinder. A temporary measure. It seals the beacon, but the entity. It is the beacon. Always was. The light is its eye, its lure. And now. It has a new keeper. A new sacrifice. The cycle continues. Dean dropped the logbook, the thud echoing in the small room. He stared at the faded ink, the words burning into his mind. He wasn't free. He was merely the next in a long line, bound to the lighthouse, bound to the entity, a silent sentinel ensuring the light continued to shine, and the ancient horror remained contained.